I remember the exact sound the room made when they dismissed me. Not the words those came wrapped in cordial politeness, tied up in bureaucratic silence like a corporate condolence letter, but the sound, it was like glass being set on a marble counter too hard. Not enough to shatter, just enough to crack beneath the surface. A moment that looked intact to anyone watching, but something vital had broken. Quietly, permanently. My name is Kael Ishida, and I didn't flinch when they took everything. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I had trained for silence. In a world addicted to noise, I let the quiet shape me. They called it a restructure. They said my position was redundant, and that another department would be absorbing my team's work, the same work I built from nothing, the same strategies I architected that were now bringing them record-breaking contracts. They called it alignment, optimization, words like polished knives. I nodded. I thanked them, and I walked out of that boardroom with my name still burning on every file they now claimed as theirs. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It was surgical. They didn't fire me because I failed. They removed me because I succeeded too quietly, because I didn't play politics, because I thought results would protect me. But I was never one of them. I wasn't born into this world with an uncle in real estate and a trust fund that smelled like summer houses and entitlement. I had built my place brick by brick, using nothing but sweat, solitude, and an understanding of systems so precise it made even their golden boys nervous. And that's why they erased me. But they forgot one thing. You don't bury a samurai with ink. You only stain the battlefield. I spent the next 3 days in a kind of silence that most people run from. No music, no phone, just my breathing, and the sound of the city outside my apartment window, too fast. Too distracted to notice the man who had just disappeared from its ranks. I let the pain settle like silt at the bottom of a still lake. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't write anything down. I didn't make plans. I observed. There's something sacred in observation and watching the chaos of others while refusing to add to it. I watched the emails that still accidentally copied me. I watched the LinkedIn announcements of my replacement, a man I had trained who once asked me how to speak in meetings without sounding nervous. I watched the internal tools that were never properly restricted after my departure. Because incompetence always hides behind urgency. They thought I was gone, but I was just as still. Stillness is not absence. It is readiness. I opened the archive I had kept for years. The documents, the workflows, the time-stamped change logs with my credentials etched into their metadata. I had no intention of suing, not yet. Legal strategy is not a hammer. It is water. Slow, Simranado 100, inevitable, and devastating if channeled with enough discipline. I studied the contracts I had reviewed, the ones they had re-signed with new vendors under my old pricing model, and I began to trace patterns like a cartographer sketching a hidden map. They hadn't stolen my ideas. They had stolen my architecture. But when you steal the blueprint, you forget one truth. Only the architect knows where the weak points live. While they celebrated, I recalibrated. Each morning began at 4:45 Army, not because I had to, but because discipline must begin before the world opens its mouth. I trained my body, not for vanity, but for clarity. I read the strategy memos of companies that outmaneuvered giants. I studied legal precedent, the kind that shapes silence into swords. I cleaned my apartment until everything had a home. I treated my mind like a dojo, every corner swept, every distraction disarmed. And in the center of it all, no bitterness, only clarity. Bitterness clouds precision. I didn't want revenge that felt good. I wanted justice that felt permanent. I created a new name, a new consulting shell, a new identity, not to hide, but to separate my next chapter from the fingerprints they left on my past. Through quiet channels, I began attracting clients, not with ads, not with noise, but through reputation. Through one cold email that landed like a whisper in the right ear. Through introductions from people who remembered that Kael Ishida had once saved a sinking quarter with nothing but Excel and instinct. I watched the projects come in, one by one. From startups, from foreign investors, from old rivals of the company that had once let me go. They didn't know I was behind the pitch decks. They just saw results. And still, I said nothing. No LinkedIn post. No press of my someone to information. No grand declaration of return. Because power doesn't announce itself. It arrives. But they started to notice. I saw it in the recruiter message that landed in my inbox one Tuesday afternoon. We've heard your name a few times lately. Would you be open to reconnecting? I said no, politely. I had no interest in returning to a building that once confused silence for weakness. Because I wasn't coming back. I was building forward. Still one. Sure. The echo began to reach them. A proposal they lost. A client that pulled funding and cited consultant conflict. A pitch deck with phrases too familiar to be coincidence. That's when they looked again and realized the man they thought they buried had never gone anywhere. He had just removed his name from the wall so he could build a fortress they couldn't burn. They had called me redundant. Now they were bleeding relevance, and I had yet to raise my voice. The first time I saw my former director's name appear in a panic-threaded email chain, I didn't smile. I simply noted the timestamp. It arrived through one of the external consultants I now advised, a boutique strategy firm hired by a former Fortune 100 client I once landed for the very people who discarded me. The email wasn't about me. It was about urgent integrity concerns in the budget approval cycle tied to a recently modified operations contract. They didn't know that contract was a copy, a less elegant version of something I had authored 4 fiscal years ago. But I knew, and I knew the crack had begun. I didn't respond. I watched. People like them expect retaliation to look like a storm, messy, loud, easy to contain once it runs out of anger. But what they never expect is erosion, the kind that comes from within, the kind that rearranges the landscape without ever announcing its arrival. While they scrambled to audit compliance procedures, I was already working with a specialized firm on intellectual property analysis. Not for litigation yet, but for documentation. Quietly proving, with time-stamped iterations and authenticated drafts, that the system they were now trying to license had roots they never nurtured. The software logic, the process flow, the cross-functional operations tracker with embedded data rules, all of it bore the fingerprints of my former self. The one they called unnecessary. I had no intention of dragging them through court like a man with a grudge. That would be emotional. Predictable. Mike. Instead, I prepared an offer. I drafted it like a final move in shogi deliberate, purity and witty, with no dramatic flair. Licensing rights, retroactive acknowledgement, non-disparagement, mutual release, and a sealed agreement that protected their face while ensuring my legacy could not be erased by a convenience narrative. I didn't ask for a public apology. That's for people who still need applause. I only required acknowledgement in the record and compensation for the architecture they built upon. They received the letter on a Tuesday. They responded in silence. Because what do you say to a man who never shouted when you struck him? What do you say when he simply turned, documented your hands, and returned with a mirror? While they deliberated with legal, I met with a small group of mentees I had begun mentoring behind the scenes. Young minds, focused, brilliant, tired of being shaped into machines by corporate procedure. I didn't lecture them. I didn't tell them revenge stories. I taught them systems, pattern recognition, psychological leverage, how to identify the moment someone sells you comfort in exchange for your power. And in teaching them, I rebuilt something within myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. Not just my name, my purpose. I never wanted power in the way those men defined it. Corner offices, board votes, newsletters that mistake exposure for legacy. I wanted the ability to create, to shape environments where intellect was respected more than volume, where ideas were protected, where silence wasn't seen as submission. It took betrayal for me to remember that. Their eventual reply came through an intermediary, a partner I once recommended for a government bid they later failed to secure. She knew the game. She also knew me. Her email was terse, respectful, an invitation to negotiate without war. She had seen the wreckage their arrogance had left behind. I replied with 3 sentences. A counter, a deadline, a single clause that ensured this could not be repackaged into another internal promotion story for one of their own. They agreed. The document was signed, not in court, not in public, but in a sealed negotiation room where no one raised their voice because real leverage doesn't require yelling. And when I walked out of that building for the second time, it wasn't as the man they discarded. It was as the architect they could no longer deny. But I didn't celebrate. I didn't post about the victory. I didn't even save a copy of the transfer confirmation to my desktop. I just stood at the edge of the city that once ignored me and listened to its noise. And in the middle of that noise, I felt nothing but stillness. Because I hadn't won by proving them wrong. I had won by becoming undeniable on my own terms. They didn't lose to a lawsuit. They lost to my discipline. They lost to every morning I rose without resentment, every choice I made with precision, every time I refused to let their noise disturb my silence. And now, they knew it. People began to ask for interviews, thought pieces, conferences. The man who took on the firm. I declined them all. Not because I was afraid of visibility, but because notoriety is not legacy. Legacy is the unseen pattern you leave behind in the minds of those who will build what comes next. I had nothing left to prove, but I had everything left to build. From behind closed doors, I shaped a new framework, not just for consulting, but for resilience. I called it Kaiho, after the Japanese word for release. Not release from others, release from needing to be seen. Release from responding to every injustice with war. A philosophy built on quiet force, on clarity over noise, on strategy over spectacle. And as the world around me started whispering my name again, I only whispered one thing back. Not yet, not loudly. Not ever for them, just for the ones who were still silent, waiting, watching, building. Because the strongest ones, they never needed to announce their return. They simply walked in with so much presence. The room recognized it before they spoke. And in that silence, I had already won. There was a time I thought vindication would taste like fire hot. Overwhelming, undeniable. But when it came, it felt like clean water. Quiet, necessary. I watched them shift. Not collapse, no. They were too insulated for that. But shift, like a structure realizing its foundation had been poured wrong. And the architects were no longer alive to explain it. You could see it in their decisions. The cautious hires, the sudden change in tone from their press releases, a rebranding campaign that smelled like fear-wearing perfume. They had become reactive, and I was already elsewhere. I rented a small studio in the old district not for status, but for solitude. Exposed concrete, black steel beams, and one wall of glass that overlooked nothing spectacular. I liked that. It kept me grounded. Reminded me that clarity doesn't need decoration. I filled the space with only what served focus. A desk, mat, and a whiteboard that bore no names, only patterns. One. Each morning, I returned to the same question. What endures? Not what grows fast, not what sells. What endures? Because the world is obsessed with momentum, and momentum, when undirected, is just movement in disguise. I had no interest in movement anymore, only direction. From that place, I wrote the framework for Kaiho, not a consultancy, not a program, a code designed for those who had been broken in silence, discarded with a smile, and told to be grateful for the wound. People like me, people sharper than their titles, but too silent to be heard in rooms run by volume. I recruited slowly. No ads, no campaigns, only whispers. A dinner here, a private message there. People began showing up. Former analysts, fired executives, disillusioned engineers, poets trapped in tech companies. They came not because I offered a fix, but because I didn't. I offered a mirror, and a map. I taught them what I had taught myself. Not how to fight, but how to disappear with discipline and reemerge with force. How to become the one the system couldn't digest. Not because you were loud, but because you were too clear to be manipulated. One woman, had been a product strategist for a major AI firm before they wrote her out of a patent she co-authored. She was 28, quiet, brilliant. I didn't tell her to sue. I showed her the leverage she already owned and watched her turn it into something they couldn't replicate. Independent authority. One man, Damien, had walked away from a CFO position after a board leak framed him for a forecast error. He still woke up at 3 a.m. and his body convinced he was under attack. I didn't offer therapy. I offered process. We rebuilt his timeline, cleaned it, verified every action. He now consults with 3 different startups that once tried to recruit his replacement. I didn't give them weapons. I reminded them that their mind was one. And I watched as they began to build not from anger, but from clarity. That's when the calls came again. Not from them. From those who had watched me walk through the fire without raising my voice. VC firms, political advisors, military liaisons. They didn't understand what I had done, only that it worked. They asked if I would speak, consult, train. I refused, because I wasn't done building what I came here to build. A system that didn't just protect the disciplined, but birthed them. Not a revolution, an evolution. But power attracts power. And soon, I began to see it, the shift in posture when I entered a room, the delayed glances, the names whispered when I passed. They didn't know the details, but they knew I was not to be underestimated. Not anymore. They didn't call me dangerous. They called me unreadable. And they were right, because by the time they tried to analyze my next move, I had already redefined the game they thought we were playing. I remember one meeting in particular, a private investment group, 6 chairs, 3 nations represented. They wanted my insight on a geopolitical modeling strategy I had quietly authored. One man, ex-military, leaned in and said, "You're not just a strategist, are you?" I looked at him, and I said nothing, because power doesn't answer questions it didn't ask for. He leaned back and nodded. They signed the contract within 72 hours. No revisions, no objections. Just silence, the kind that follows when someone realizes they're sitting across from a man who has already dismantled the system they're still trying to climb. And yet, none of this changed me. I still woke up before the sun, still drank my coffee black, still trained with the same movements I learned when I was 19, and trying to find something that made me feel unshakable. Because ritual keeps power humble, and clarity without humility is just ego with good posture. I never let myself forget what they took. Not because I still needed to punish them, but because the scar was the blueprint. They drew the lines when they betrayed me. I just traced them until they led to something better. And now, every decision I make, every contract I draft, every whisper I speak into the right ear, it carries the precision of a blade that no longer cuts from rage, but from memory. I don't chase justice. I am justice. When rendered with discipline, and I've learned that is the most terrifying power of all. The real shift didn't happen when they paid me. It happened when they stopped pretending they didn't know my name. There's a certain pause, almost imperceptible, that people make when they recognize power, but aren't sure how to greet it. They hesitate, mid-sentence, glancing for confirmation in someone else's eyes, like looking for permission to show respect. That pause started happening more often, in boardrooms, in back channels, at dinners where nothing was ever truly casual. They would lean in as if they were about to ask me what I really did, but they never did. Because men like me don't speak loudly. We don't explain ourselves. And in a world addicted to validation, restraint has become its own kind of seduction. I didn't build Kaiho to impress them. I built it to replace them. Quietly, effortlessly, not with rebellion, but with refinement. Every move I made from that point forward was designed like a shogi game in the final act, not to win faster, but to win clean, not to dominate, but to displace a different kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to tear you down because it knows eventually you'll offer yourself up just to stay close to it. And yet, as the circle grew, my world grew smaller, more precise. I stopped attending anything that didn't serve stillness. My wardrobe simplified. My conversation shortened. I gave up trying to be understood and embraced being remembered. There's freedom in not being readable, and there's unimaginable influence in being the one who defines the terms. The clients began referring to me not by name, but by phrases, the one who sees through, the man with the map, Nasarut, the architect, and still I didn't raise my voice. I didn't advertise. I didn't even correct them. Because the truth is, once you've been betrayed at the root, you no longer hunger for surface recognition. You hunger for precision, and I had it. One night, I received an anonymous file. No message, just data. It was clean, untraceable, and encrypted. It contained internal documents from the firm that once cut me out. A junior associate, disillusioned, had passed them through a mutual contact. The documents outlined a planned acquisition one that would fold 3 of their competitor portfolios into a shadow fund designed to bypass regulatory scrutiny. It was legal, but it was delicate. And with the wrong kind of pressure, it could collapse. I didn't act, not immediately. I waited. And while I waited, I refined my understanding of their new play. Every structure has seams. Every arrogance, thus erasure, an opening. I mapped their pressure points not to destroy, but to decide. And then I made a call, not to a lawyer, not to a journalist, to a compliance officer I once mentored, now working in a quiet desk at a transnational review board. She owed me nothing, but she respected clarity. I asked only one question. If something reached your desk that looked like a gray zone acquisition strategy designed to avoid market accountability, would you see it? She said, if it were annotated properly, I wouldn't just see it, I'd remember who sent it. So I sent it. No name, no return, only silence. 2 weeks later, the acquisition was halted. They didn't know where the pressure came from, but I watched their panic unfold in carefully staged statements and non-denial denials. They scrambled to patch holes in a ship that hadn't even left port. And I watched the storm gather around them, not because I wanted to see them drown, but because they had learned nothing. Even after everything, they still believed the system was theirs to gain. And I had to remind them. Systems belong to the disciplined, not the powerful, not the loud, the disciplined. And in that moment, I realized something that surprised even me. I didn't hate them anymore. I pitied them. Because they had spent their lives building towers without foundations. And now, each gust of wind felt like an enemy. Each question, a threat. They had become fragile in their own fortress, while I stood unshaken in open ground. The echo of what I had done reached places I hadn't anticipated. One evening, I received a letter, handwritten, on no return address. Inside was a single line. I watched what they did to you. I couldn't stop it, but I learned from it. No signature. I didn't need one. Legacy isn't about being thanked. It's about being followed, without asking. And now, I knew I wasn't walking alone anymore. The path I carved in silence had become a road others were now walking. Quietly, precisely without begging for permission, without apologizing for their clarity. It wasn't a movement. It was a mirror. And everywhere it turned, the illusion of power cracked, not with explosions, but with light. I no longer spoke about what they did to me, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defined the structure of my breath. That's the quiet truth no one tells you about betrayal. It's not the act itself that ruins you. It's the echo, the distortion it sends into every mirror you look into after. The tendency to doubt the parts of yourself they tried to delete. But once you reclaim that mirror, once you refuse to reflect their damage as your identity, they lose their final hold on you. And I had reclaimed it. Every morning, I stepped into ritual. Not out of superstition, but because the body needs anchors when the world is fluid. I moved through the same sequence. Floor, cold water, stretch, silence. One page of rereading something ancient, something deliberate, not for knowledge, but for rhythm. Then stillness. That's where my moves came from. Stillness. While they were panicking about market shifts, I was investing in frameworks. While they scrambled to contain reputational fallout, I was acquiring silence, buying into companies not for brand, but for blind spots. I took majority shares in firms they had ignored, the quiet ones doing deep work with no PR department. And I did it through front-facing entities they wouldn't trace back to me. By the time they realized, the value was already in my hands. I didn't just outmaneuver them. I rewrote the blueprint of what mattered. Because when you take from someone who is still reactive, all you remove is surface. But when you take from someone who plans from silence, you're taking from the source. And I had become the source. They tried to replicate it. Of course, were quiet consultants. New discipline-first mottos. Board retreats focused on internal restraint. I watched it all with the detachment of a man who sees someone buying a katana without ever learning how to hold it. Because silence isn't a tactic. It's a vow. And discipline isn't a brand. It's a lifetime. I moved like fog through systems they thought were opaque. I aligned with regulators they thought were toothless. I lobbied policies they never bothered to read, not for personal gain, but to ensure the games they used to win by default were no longer even playable. Then, I vanished. Not physically, symbolically. I stopped attending the circles where power recycled itself. I stopped replying to their private invitations. I let them wonder where I had gone, while they quoted frameworks I'd authored under names they didn't recognize. And while they built echo chambers, I built Kaiho Guild. Not a company, a network. No offices, no public directories. Only access granted through proof of clarity, not pedigree. A living structure of thinkers, doers, and builders all trained in the art of self-removal, of invisible construction, of power without spectacle. We didn't disrupt industries. We replaced the nervous systems they operated on, quietly, precisely, permanently. One client said it best. After implementing our model, it didn't feel like transformation. It felt like finally being in rhythm with something I'd been hearing my whole life, but never had words for. That's what Kaiho had become. A language for those who never had one, but always knew. The room changed when they spoke now. Because when you speak from stillness, people don't just hear you. They feel the weight of everything you didn't say. And still, I didn't take credit. Because Kaiho was never about me. It was the weapon I forged in the dark. Not to strike back, but to cut a new path forward. And yet, even in peace, the echoes of old wars come knocking. One day, a package arrived. No, to Meru. Just a glossy magazine with an embossed cover story. The man who rebuilt precision. The photo was of my former director, smiling, standing in front of a whiteboard with diagrams I recognized down to the angle of the arrows. It was mine, my model, my sequence, rebranded under a new name and a louder man. They had come full circle, taking again, and this time, they thought I wouldn't respond. But what they didn't understand was that response isn't always reaction. Sometimes it's erasure. I didn't send a lawsuit. I sent a silence so complete, their model stopped working because it was designed in my rhythm. And when I changed the current, their entire system fell out of sync. Clients began to leave. Investors started asking questions. The narrative frayed. Because you cannot build permanence on borrowed clarity, and they had borrowed everything. One by one, their names faded from articles. Their tags stopped trending. Their leadership structure changed. And I kept moving. Not faster, just deeper. Until no one could trace me, but everyone could feel the echo of my decisions. Because the true strike, it's not when you hit them. It's when you stop needing to, and the world adjusts itself around your quiet. I sometimes wonder if they ever sit alone, long after midnight, and remember the day they decided I was expendable. Not out of vengeance, out of curiosity. If there is a moment, even one, where they revisit the softness in my voice, when I thank them for the opportunity, even as they took the floor out from under me, if they think back to the files I left behind, neatly organized, almost as if I was preparing not to return, but to rebuild elsewhere, because I wasn't leaving empty. I was leaving clear, and there's a difference. The world mistakes clarity for coldness, but they're wrong. Coldness is reaction shut down. Clarity is emotion refined. What I did after they erased me wasn't an act of bitterness. It was an act of becoming. No one saw it coming. Not because I was hidden, but because they were only ever trained to see threats that announce themselves. I didn't announce. I simply was. And now, all these years later, my name is rarely spoken in full, not out of erasure, out of reverence. Because a name like mine, when said aloud, doesn't just recall a man, it recalls a method. Kael Ishida isn't a headline. He's a footnote in the transformation of systems that no longer remember how they began. I walk through cities now, where I've never lived, and watch companies running protocols I designed in the dark. I pass by buildings I once pitched in, where my diagrams hang in conference rooms under different signatures. And I don't stop, because legacy doesn't require attention. It requires alignment. There are those who still reach out. New executives, thought leaders, eager minds who ask how I survived it all. I always respond the same way. I didn't survive. I realigned. They ask for formulas. I give them silence, because wisdom isn't something I can give. It's something they must strip from themselves, layer by layer, until what's left is not armor, but architecture. Stillness is not passive. It's pressure under control. Discipline is not restriction. It's direction. And betrayal. Betrayal is a gift, but only if you let it teach you the difference between being seen and being undeniable. I remember the final time I saw him. The man who signed my severance. He didn't recognize me. Not in the suit. Not in the space. Not in the silence. De one stum. He passed by me in a hotel lobby, flanked by handlers, face drawn and voice sharp from the weight of too many appearances. Too few truths. His eyes, once confident, scanned past mine as if searching for something familiar. And I gave him nothing. Not anger, not recognition, not even acknowledgement. Because in that moment, the power balance wasn't just restored, it had reversed. I had no need for his apology. He had already become the cautionary tale I never had to write. He would walk through the rest of his career wondering how it all slipped through fingers too busy clenching. And I decided I would continue walking forward. Hands open, unburdened by the past, but shaped by its lessons. This is not the story of revenge. It's the story of return, not to the old ground, but to the place inside me that had always known. I was never meant to compete within their system. I was meant to replace it, not with rage, but with quiet precision, not with noise, but with permanence. Sigirwade os. And now, Wabewo, I no longer need the world to know I was right. Because the world, it already moves in the direction I once drew in silence. That's the final strike, the one they never feel until it's far too late, the one that leaves no scar. Only the haunting realization that the man they underestimated never needed to fight. He only needed to build what they could never unmake. And now, they walk in the shadow of that architecture, forever, for Miri Tiristum.